My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and this year I'm the course convener for the French Language Variation and Change, which is just one of the numerous exciting options that you could choose from if you decided to come to Cambridge University to study French. Today I want to share with you a slightly abridged version of the fourth lecture in this course, which is about language shift. Language shift is part of the whole debate on language endangerment, language planning, language death. And I think it's really, really important. All these things tie in very closely with people's sense of identity, their sense of community, the value that they put on their language and by extension, their culture. And decisions that are made regarding language planning and the state of different languages can really make a difference to the lives of individuals and communities. So it's something I feel personally quite strongly about. My own research interests are in Gabon and Cameroon, particularly relating to language planning and language endangerment. So I hope you find this as interesting as I do. So I'm going to talk about what language shift is, how it comes about, what people think about it. We'll look at a few case studies and a framework called the GIDS, which is very interesting, and a few ideas on language death. This map here shows the shaded areas, the coloured areas are the areas where about 50% of the world's languages are spoken. So you can see in the really dark red areas, there's a very, very high density of languages. And interestingly, these are also areas where there's a very high level of language endangerment as well. A lot of these languages are at risk. So what is language shift? Here's a little definition which I will allow you to read. So as you can see, language shift is all about a mismatch of power and prestige, a perceived one. It might or might not actually be real. And it's where people literally shift from using one language to using another one for various reasons, mostly sociolinguistic, social reasons. This is a sign that I saw in Gabon, in Libreville, in the capital city, in the town hall. Kindly express yourself in French. Gabon is a former French colony. The only official language there is French, despite the fact that there are 60 to 65 indigenous languages, none of which is a lingua franca. So a lingua franca is a term meaning a language that everyone's familiar with, and none of them has any kind of official status. Okay, and a lingua franca is necessary in a country where, you know, potentially you could have a lot of problems of communication with people all speaking different languages. Hence the presence of this poster, and hence the continuing existence of French and also English and Portuguese in sub-Saharan Africa as official languages. Okay, they act as lingua francas. They're ethnically neutral. They don't favour any particular ethnic group. But a general problem, which is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, is a gradual shift away from local languages towards those former colonial languages. So language death is when a language dies out altogether. You may also hear the terms language suicide, language murder. They're very emotionally charged terms, which just shows how strongly a lot of people feel about this whole matter. And du langue glottophage, so that's a language that eats another language. So languages in this sort of discourse are very often almost personified, if you like. I got a little carried away with transition effects here. These people in this picture, they're protesting about the language situation in France. They want Occitan to become an official language, okay? And a lot of protests like this take place in various countries around the world. In the world, there are around 7,000 languages. About 20% of those are endangered. And interestingly and significantly, only 23 out of those 7,000 account for what half the world speaks. So actually a tiny minority have a monopoly in the world. About a third of the world's languages are in Africa, and it's estimated that, well, some estimates are very, very pessimistic. Some scholars believe that up to 90% of all languages may disappear in the next 100 years, which is a very alarming thought, really. There are 3 websites which are very interesting for finding out about this. I have put them. There should be a little handout accompanying this presentation, and I have put those on the handout for you. Ethnologue is a bit tricky. I think you're allowed 5 free visits. After that, you have to subscribe, and don't think that you can log on from 5 different computers. I've tried that. It somehow knows that it's you every time. I don't know how it knows, but anyway, for your 5 visits, you will find it very interesting. You can search by country or by language and find out everything you need to know about the languages that they've surveyed, which is pretty much all of them. Endangeredlanguages.com, that's got a really good interactive atlas. You can mouse over a language and it will tell you, all its statistics. And UNESCO, of course, have got a lot of information on languages as well. Right. So, factors leading to language shift. First of all, here are some interesting images. So, this is a book about Fang in Gabon. This is the language spoken by the largest number of people, the indigenous language spoken by the largest number of people. But it's nowhere near becoming a lingua franca because it's not a language that's commonly understood by different ethnic groups. The title is I Get By in Fang. Speak Fang immediately. So that's an example of trying to combat language shift, okay, promoting Fang by producing a book that makes it seem very easy for you to master this probably extremely difficult language. We also got a web page in a Wikipedia page in Wolof, which is a language of Senegal, okay, and there's an increasing move towards getting more and more online content into away from the few 23 languages that have the monopoly, and across to more languages which have a less currency. Okay, so let's look at some sociolinguistic factors leading to shift. Well, the presence of a prestige language, we've established that already. I mentioned that earlier. That could be an official language, say French, Portuguese, English, or it could be a strong indigenous lingua franca. Languages like, for example, Swahili or Hausa, okay, they have quite a large geographical range, and they tend to be languages that people in that geographical area are familiar with, even if they're not their mother tongue. You might have 2 similar variants undergoing leveling, so that is where 2 related languages start to resemble each other more and more, and then they will eventually become so similar as to actually become one language. So that means you've gone from 2 down to 1. Language policy, now this very often promotes monolingualism, especially when you have, say, in Gabon, a multilingual country with only 1 language which has been raised to official status, and it's not even a Gabonese language. Speaker attitudes. This has been documented for North Sotho in South Africa, and also I noticed it for the Nzebi language in Gabon. If it's a language like Nzebi, where speakers of Nzebi would say to me, well, it's people sometimes make fun of us and there are jokes about Nzebis and stuff. If people have a negative perception of a language, that's not going to help in terms of promoting and preserving it, and that's going to encourage shift away from it potentially. The next 2 things tying together, lack of standardization and the absence of a written tradition. If a language can be written down, it can be captured for posterity. If it doesn't have a writing system, that's going to be very, very difficult. And the problem is that actually writing systems are in a minority in the world. We take writing for granted. Many, many languages in the world do not have any written form at all. Lack of standardization, that's another problem. If you haven't got dictionaries and you haven't got grammars, the language isn't codified. Then it makes it very difficult to teach it in schools. And if it's absent from the education system, then again, it's going to be very hard to raise the status of the language, to make people think it's important, to make people think it's valuable, and obviously to actually teach it to children as well. Technically, in Cameroon, the local languages are still banned. There was a law passed in colonial times banning them. Hasn't actually been repealed yet. I think they seem to have forgotten. So yeah, that's a long-standing problem as a colonial legacy of local languages being banned in France, as well as in colonies, former French colonies outside France. The demographics of a weaker speech community, that can lead to shift. If you've got a very low fertility rate, a very low birth rate, you'll have fewer people and consequently fewer potential speakers. Other problems relating to shift are that in terms of learning languages in Nigeria, it's been recorded that young people often see learning a local language in school as a soft option or drudgery. It's not really a worthwhile thing to do. It's a bit of a drag, you know. And sometimes people undervalue their own language as well. They describe it just as a patois. It's just a dialect, you know. They don't acknowledge the actual importance that it may have. Okay, so this is the GIDS, the Graded Intergenerational Disruption Scale. Fishman is a really interesting guy, and I strongly recommend his books. I've put a couple of them in your little handout and at the end of this presentation as well. So he's got, oh, I'm very sorry, under where my head is, it should say at risk, okay? So at the top of his scale, number 1, and I moved my picture thinking that it would be in the right place. It's still in the wrong place, I do apologize. So at the beginning, at the top of the scale, so if a language is used in higher education and official domains or government functions and mass media, it's secure, okay? If conversely, we go down the scale, okay, if it's used only by elderly, socially isolated speakers, it's at risk, we can assume, all right? And I've applied Fishman's scale. I did this for a lecture. I applied Fishman's scale to the language situation in Cameroon, and I looked at how you can relate every point on his scale to the local languages vis-a-vis French and English in Cameroon. It's got 2 official languages, and what we can infer from that. So let's have a look. It's always fun to apply a theoretical framework to a real life situation you've observed. Yeah, so at risk should still be down there where my head is. So yeah, the official languages are secure, okay, they're the sole vehicles of higher education. And very interestingly, they've been reanalyzed by quite a lot of young people. When I asked in a survey I did, so which Cameroonian languages do you speak? Oh, I speak both French and English. So a lot of young people have actually reinterpreted them as being local languages. They don't perceive them as being foreign languages at all anymore, which is very interesting. We have a little bit of vernacular use in television and radio. So local languages are used in Cameroon in things like party political broadcasts and public health bulletins and things like that. But the press and internet are only in French and English. There are certain regional lingua francas in the northeast mainly, but actually French and English are the lingua francas of choice. They're also the sole vehicles of primary and secondary education, okay? So as you can see so far, it's not looking too good for the local languages. So the only thing which is secure is the position of the official languages so far. French and English are by far the most widely written languages. I think as many as 4 different alphabets have been proposed for the Cameroonian languages, but there's very often a problem of consensus in these situations. 4 alphabets, have we actually picked one yet? Well, it's all a bit vague, unfortunately. Yeah, so French and English are increasingly mother tongues for young people as well, particularly in urban areas. And I've noticed, well, it's been noticed in all the literature about Cameroon, actually, massive vertical attrition of the local languages, the vernaculars. And vertical attrition is essentially where parents stop teaching the local language or stop passing on the local language to their children. They may try to, and they may just meet with resistance, or it may be a choice. They might think, well, actually, you know, my child's not much point in knowing Nzebi or Eton or whatever. It's much better for them to learn French. When I was in Gabon, I met another academic who is a speaker of an indigenous language and whose life's work revolves around the preservation of the indigenous languages, and his children couldn't speak them at all. Not for want of his trying, it's just the way that society is going, it's the direction that society is going in a lot of these regions. French and English are less dominant among older speakers, okay? So we're getting down to the at-risk point here. So far, the only really secure languages in the first 6 points are French and English. They're less dominant among older speakers. However, French and English are viewed as a symbol of increasing urbanization and move away from traditional ways of life. they're not viewed as being local languages. They're not considered to be cool by young people. They're not considered to be a way out of your country, a way to bigger things, a way to a profession, a career, and things like that. A speaker I interviewed in Cameroon, I remember, a speaker of Lamsa, told me about the fact that his village had died out. I asked, do you ever go to your village? Well, no, it's died out. And so there's a strong correlation between people who don't visit the village and people who don't know the local language. The village and the grandparents and the elders, that's where a lot of these languages reside. And inevitably, the more people travel to the cities, the more those communities will disappear. And I read quite a sad statistic in the ethnologue. The Pam language in Cameroon in 1996 had 30 speakers. That was 1996, that was a long time ago. So it's quite possibly got none at all. We can imagine that Pam was spoken maybe just in a village and by elderly people who've now died. And so that language could conceivably have died as well. Frameworks for language shift. Okay, so this is a classification by Wright, which was very interesting, I thought. So we might have, to begin with, a viable and problematic language, French, for example. You might have a small speech community, okay, of a minority language, and it survives due to its status or isolation. I read about a speech community, a Francophone speech community in Canada. Okay, so it's outside the French-speaking area. It's surrounded by English-speaking communities, but it's actually, because it's got a really strong sense of identity, and it's because of its difference and its isolation. It's different from the surrounding areas, so people feel really inclined to keep on using French and to really safeguard the use of French in their community. So yeah, we then move to the uncertain category. So speakers are not really committed to the language because it's not considered socially advantageous. All right, spoken more by adults than by children. Typically, an adult would speak to their child in the local language. The child would answer back in French or in English or whatever. Contracting, so this is the fourth category, and this is where younger speakers are monolingual in another language, so not in the local language, okay? And most speakers are over 50, crucially over childbearing age, so unlikely to have any more children, unlikely to have that first generation contact with children and the opportunity to teach them their ancestral language. And then we get to the point where the language is extinct because there are no monolinguals left, or nearly extinct because the monolinguals are very old. Interestingly, when I was doing my research in Cameroon, another question I asked people was, young people, I worked mainly with school students, was, do you know of any schools where local languages are taught? And again, and they didn't know. Okay, so not only are there all these problems of vertical transmission, there are also major problems of simply publicity, because there are schools where local languages are taught, but a lot of people don't actually know about them. They don't really know of their existence. So many factors, all interdependent, which tie in here. Okay, so I took Wright's classification and I applied it to Gabon, to my own findings in Gabon. Gabon is here in the Gulf of Guinea. So French is the sole official language in Gabon, and it's got a rising number of mother tongue speakers, like the children of the scholar who I mentioned just now. The strongest competitor for French is Fang. Okay, Fang is found in the monolingual province of Wallo-and-Tem in the north of the country. It's also spoken in Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea. So it's a cross-border language. So it's not just useful in Gabon, you can go to Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon with it as well. And the Fang people are very, very attached to their culture. They're very proud of their culture. And in all my work in Gabon, I found that the people who are most likely to speak an indigenous language are the Fang. French, however, is perceived as the only pathway to success, okay? And the government, generally speaking, it's fair to say, is quite apathetic regarding language preservation. You may argue, well, you know, they've got a lot of other fish to fry, but even so, there are very, very few government initiatives. It's mainly grassroots initiatives, if anything, that try to keep the local languages afloat. And French is increasingly being reanalyzed as a Gabonese language. It's a sole vehicle of education, and this favours the emergence of monoglots, people who only know French, because they're not really exposed to anything else in a systematic way. And it's in isolated rural areas where you do tend to find the local language communities. And for that reason, it's believed that half of the local languages in Gabon may disappear in the next century. So what influences shift towards French in Gabon? Well, here's a map of Gabon with all the provinces. This is the Wallo and Tem province. You find Fang in Estuaire as well. Nzebi and Punu, these are the second and third most spoken languages in Gabon, and these are the areas where they're found. These initials, by the way, this is from Guthrie's classification of the Bantu languages. So Fang is the A group, and it's number 75 in that group. They're very interesting. Guthrie's work is really interesting on how those languages can be categorized. Anyway, so the informants' perceptions of why shift is happening are these. So brain drain, no one wants to be in Gabon, they all want to go and live abroad. Well, in that case, we need to know French. If we only know Nzebi, we can't really go because no one will understand us. And they blame the government. No, the government doesn't care, they don't want to do anything. And general globalization, well, you know, everyone's becoming sort of more and more monolingual, you know, we're all starting to speak European languages, you know, it's the way ahead for the planet. But there are other contributing factors as well. So lack of standardization, governmental apathy, but also I think a degree of community apathy as well. There are grassroots organizations, and there are a lot more in Cameroon, according to what I've found. And at the end of the day, it's down to the speakers whether a language survives or not. A government can say, right, you're going to learn this in school, but they can say you're going to speak this at home, but they can't determine whether you speak a particular language at home or not. They can't force you to do that. They can determine what language your textbook is in, but not how you communicate with your parents. So much of the onus is actually on speech communities themselves. They're believed to be very difficult to acquire. That's another problem. And also they're believed to be unsuited to technical functions, which simply isn't true. Any language can be technicalized. Any language can have terminology created, okay, to talk about information technology or medicine or agriculture or whatever. Okay, so yeah, again, lots and lots of interdependent factors. Right, check out the honeycomb, dear me. I really did get carried away here. Okay, so attitudes towards language shift. So very, very ambivalent, all right? So on the one hand, well, it's an ethnically unifying force. It's a good thing, but it's a necessary evil, and it's just another language. It's a colonial legacy we've got to put up with it. It's not ours, but it's our lot. Also, it's indispensable as a lexically productive administrative and technical language. And then people who go, well, actually, but that's its only role. It's not good for anything else, okay? So we have to use it through necessity. And then people who say, well, it's une langue d'ouverture, so it's an opening language. And then other people who say, but it's killing the local language. And these are particularly Fang people who use this very, very emotive term vocabulary that's killing the local language. It's a parasite. And you know, it really is for some people a source of conflicts relating to their own identity, and even kind of the outright rejection of their actual origins as well. Okay, frameworks for language death. This is taken from Tsunoda in 2006. So we've got, how do languages die? We've got sudden glotticide. That's when all the speakers are wiped out. That might happen in a situation of genocide, for example. Okay, there's a sudden cataclysm and large speech communities are killed off. It doesn't happen terribly often, fortunately. You've got gradual glotticide where the language dies off gradually, okay? You've got sudden language shift. That's when people deliberately move away from a language that they used to speak normally. Again, that might happen in a genocide situation where people are desperate not to be identified as being members of a particular ethnic group, so they stop speaking their language and they move away to another one to conceal their identity and origins. And then the fourth one, gradual language shift, that's the most usual thing. People just bit by bit over a period of years, possibly generations, move away from typically a local language and they move towards a former colonial language or a strong indigenous language. There's also an obsolescing stage in this framework, which is a little more complex than I've shown here. So there's an intermediate phase of bilingualism quite often, where you've got you speak the two languages at the same level, and then the dominant one, the prestige one, bit by bit begins to take over. And also a proficiency continuum by age. Okay, so typically the more proficient you are, the older you probably are. All right, and the younger you are, the less knowledge you have of the local language, and possibly the less you'll be considerably less interested in it as well. I should point out that this is lecture 4 in the course. Lecture 1 was lexical borrowing. Lecture 2, so that's just borrowing words. Lecture 2, syntactic borrowing, that is borrowing structures. Lecture 3, code switching, that's where people who are bilingual mix and match between the two languages in one sentence. And then language shift. So I was trying to create a kind of pyramid of language change, starting with the smallest elements, just the words, and then coming down to structures, and then bits of sentences, and then getting to a point where we're actually moving from one language over to another one. And linguists like Claude Agege, for example, who's not keen on borrowing and says it's the thin end of the wedge, it's when languages start to lose their integrity, would argue that lexical borrowing is where this begins. This is where language shift and consequently death begins. This is an image of a language protest in Cameroon. So the people are protesting against the fact that there are these two official languages, okay, which have, in the view of many people, contributed to discrimination in the population. There are 10 provinces. 8 of them are francophone and 2 of them are anglophone, and the anglophones very often feel discriminated against, and these people are protesting against the fact that Cameroonians are often pigeonholed in terms of which official language they are associated with, largely by where they live or simply by their upbringing, actually. Okay, we've also got Dorian's framework for language death. Now, Dorian has worked a lot on Gaelic, okay, and she established a typology of speakers where you've got older fluent speakers who don't diverge from the norm very much. We've got younger fluent speakers. They diverge, they're less conservative, and crucially, their divergences go unnoticed. They don't really realize that they're not speaking the local language quite correctly. And you've got semi-speakers, what we call semi-speakers. They're not very proficient, and they're much more at home in the dominant language. So they speak the other language a bit, but not to the extent that it dominates for them. Okay. Also, gender and location are variables involved in language shift, which Dorian and other authors as well have noticed. Typically, female rural speakers are more conservative than, for example, male urban speakers, and older people too, as we've established. And these are children in a school classroom in Cameroon, which I visited. Okay, right. Just time for some quick little case studies. Okay, so these are some, I kind of brainstormed some situations where there's language shift and death going on and French is involved. It doesn't always work to the advantage of French, as we'll see. In the timelines, we've got French versus English versus Guerrier, which is the variety of French spoken in Jersey. Okay, Guerrier is dying out. It's competing against 2 very strong official languages. Okay, so French, which is kind of like the standard version of Guerrier, and then English, which is the official language of the place where Guerrier is spoken. All right, so it's got two problems to deal with. France is a multilingual country, believe it or not, and that's not immediately obvious from French language policy, which still rather favours centralisation and unity. All goes back to the French Revolution. Okay, suffice to say that French and Breton are up against each other, French and Gallo. Breton and Gallo, so Gallo is a language spoken in Brittany, together with Breton, all right? So Gallo has got 2 languages which are kind of greater than it is. We've got French versus Corsican, French and Occitan, French and Wallon, which is in the northeast of the country, and French and Tahitian as well, because French Polynesia is part of this picture too. And most of these languages are endangered, okay? Some of them are dying out or seriously restricted in their use as well. And interestingly, the law which allowed local languages to be taught, regional languages to be taught in schools in France, was not implemented in French Polynesia for decades. It took decades for it to take effect there. Fortunately, Tahitian is part of a very, very strong culture, a very proud culture. So it has that advantage, but there are many other Polynesian languages. So they're all up against Tahitian and French, if you like, if we're going to look at it in terms of languages being up against each other. Gabon, I've mentioned that. We've got French on the one hand, local languages on the other. Cameroon, French and the local languages, and French versus English, I mentioned. The fact that Anglophones often feel discriminated against. They feel that, you know, they're not given as much importance in society as speakers of French, okay? And the local languages are dying out, as I've said. Canada, French versus English, okay? So, we've got the Office Québécois de la Langue Française, who go around, an official body, who go around telling off shopkeepers who've got English signs up in their shops and things like that. So there's really quite a lot of friction there. Also in Canada, in Quebec, that is, according to the FondationLangueFrancaise.org, French is dying out due to, it's dying out, it's becoming more restricted due to a low birth rate and the attitude of immigrants. A lot of immigrants arriving in Canada and Quebec don't speak French. They English is a stronger language for them, and they would prefer to carry on using English. So many factors at work. Senegal, okay. Now in Senegal, a former French colony, French is actually receding a little. Politicians are turning more to the language of the people to get their votes, okay. And there's been an ongoing campaign of Wolofization. Now, needless to say, Wolof is a strong local language. So the other indigenous languages of Senegal have again got two quite important competitors in the form of French and Wolof. And then finally, French Guyana, a département outre-mer in South America, where French is in, it's kind of in conflict, if you like, with languages like Palikir and Kalina, which are indigenous languages. It's threatened by, they're threatened by Guyanese Creole as well. And only about 2/3 of people have an active knowledge of Palikir, for example, even if they are Palikir, of the Palikir ethnicity. There are many semi-speakers who can't really speak it at all. The language is only oral, mass lexical borrowings from French. It's got very little internal word creation, so they just borrow stuff. And also a lot of, in the case of Kalina, there's a lot of code switching between French and Kalina. So a lot of mixing of the language in sentences. As I said, that can be a precursor to language shift. And also there are serious problems of vertical transmission as well. Okay, so a little question, or three little questions for you to think about. There should be a handout accompanying this video. These three questions are on there, and also a little case study as well, which I've given you to do with Central African Republic. I've given you some information about a fictitious speaker, but I think a speaker who probably would exist. If you went to Central African Republic, you could well find that person. And I'd like you to have a think about their views and their situation and what that might entail for a language planner in the Central African Republic. A bit of reading, I highly recommend Fishman. I put in a couple of cheeky mentions of my own work, but you don't have to read it, I won't mind. But it's interesting, it's interesting. I ran it past my dad and he loved it, so. And anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this and found it interesting. If you want to know more about our courses, do visit the MMLL faculty website at too many W's, I think, mmll.cam.ac.uk, and we'd love to hear from you. Okay, hope you enjoyed it. See you soon. Bye.